Hey, folks, and welcome into episode 23 of the Longhorn Mailbag. Thanks so much for being here with us on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. The college football season is sadly over, but now the countdown to 2024's SEC slate for Texas starts, and a lot of exciting stuff to get into. So let's go ahead and jump into it. First up, from World B. Green. Can you comment on why Texas's DBs don't look back for the ball and try to intercept it? Is that something that they're not taught to do? Well, unfortunately, World B. Green, I can't attest to what Texas's DBs are taught and not taught to do. I'm not in the meeting rooms or anything like that. I wish I was, but unfortunately, they don't grant me that privilege, and probably rightfully so. So, what I can tell you is going back to spring practice, I thought about one of the drills that we saw during practice viewing time. Texas DBs had some boxing gloves on, and the drills that we saw were them, working on punching the ball out from their teammates and really working on making sure that if maybe a receiver catches a ball or a running back's got a ball in open space, that they get their fist in the right spot to knock the ball loose and cause a fumble. We've seen that a couple of times from Texas DBs, and more notably, I think Jordan Whittington's punch out was probably the biggest one this year against TCU. But nonetheless, those types of drills are pretty common, I would say. I've seen it a couple of times. I know the Seahawks, I think, used to use tennis balls a few years back for their defensive backs in the Legion of Boom era. But it's more to not just help in punching out balls and getting fumbles, but also to try and avoid those unnecessary grabbings and whatever types of gestures or movements with their arms or any contact with the receiver that would warrant a pass interference penalty. So we have seen in practice that that is big for the Texas defensive backs, and I would say they got better this year in comparison to 2022 when it comes to drawing those pass interference penalties. But a lot of coverage lapses too, and teams were able to throw all over the Longhorns this season. And you saw it against Washington, where there were a couple of plays, more notably one with Ryan Watson, and that touchdown for Washington, where I think it was Malik Muhammad who got a full paw on the ball to flip it up into the air, but it just ends up right in the hands of, I believe it was Jalen Polk for the touchdown. That the plays were there for Texas. They got in the right spots, but Michael Penix Jr. was just throwing them into an incredibly small window, something he didn't do as well against Michigan in the national championship, but he was able to do against Texas. So some of the, and granted as well, a lot of those plays were, once again, just Texas DBs not on the same page, and Washington being able to scheme their guys wide open as Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer had done all season. So a little bit of both there, but I think it's also very telling what's going on now in that room, specifically at safety. You look at the transfers out, Jaron Thompson and Keaton Crawford, two of the more notable veterans on Texas's team, electing to go elsewhere for their next season of college football. And the influx of talent that's coming in from both the portal and the high school race, more notably Andrew Makuba coming in from Clemson and Xavier Filsamy, the five-star safety coming in from McKinney High School, coming into the room now. And you also think of the talent that Texas already has in that room. You've got Malik Muhammad coming back. You've got Terrence Brooks coming back at corner. So a lot of talent in that room, and it's going to be an extremely competitive room here in the summer and into the spring with a lot of early enrollees from the high school ranks too, and maybe probably not, but if there is another transfer that comes into the mix, I don't think there will be. But where does Andrew Makuba fall on that list? Where does Filsamy fall on that list? Is somebody rising up? Does maybe a Jelani McDonald make his move and earn a spot in the starting rotation? All things left to be seen, but overall, there's a lot of time for movement on the depth chart and potential movement into the transfer portal if somebody loses a spot or isn't able to earn themselves a job. Somebody maybe doesn't want to wait, so keep an eye on that springtime window. But overall, an extremely competitive defensive backroom, I think, now going forward for Texas, because they know that that's a position, not necessarily of weakness, but a position where they can be better and where they can play better. Our next question from Pakonar46. God, I hope I pronounced that right. He really asked me a lot of questions about the edge room, about the guys who redshirted this year, Colin Simmons, Trey Moore. So I'm going to try to answer everything as best as I can. Looking at this year's redshirts first, you've got Cecilia Kana, Billy Walton, and Colton Vasek. I think all three of those guys really do have a chance to be very good for Texas if they get developed. And the favorite out of those three, at least for me, is Colton Vasek, who dealt with a back injury for a majority of the season, did not appear in a single game all year, and that kept him off the field. I think his teammates see that potential in him as well. When we were talking to guys in the spring, he earned the nickname Baby Bosa. So that's pretty high praise considering what both of the Bosa brothers have been able to do in the NFL. And if he has a solid camp and he's healthy, I can definitely see him working his way into the rotation at some point. But you also have to consider who else is in that battle in that edge room. You've got both starters returning in Ethan Burke and Barron Sorrell. You add in Trey Moore, the transfer from UTSA. He was the AAC Defensive Player of the Year this past season. And then you add in Colin Simmons, a 5-star from Duncanville at the edge position, one of the most coveted prospects in the 2024 class, now joins the ranks of Texas. All four of those guys are going to be very hard to keep off the field. So does Colton Vasek fit into that mix there? Does maybe Tassili Akana, Billy Walton, Jamon Tapp, Justice Finkley, two other guys who come back from playing some more snaps this season, where do they fit all in on the depth chart? And is that a position similar to the defensive backs where there might be some portal movement from someone in the room in the spring? All left to be seen, but another extremely talented room to keep an eye on heading into the summer and into the springtime as well. But for the DBs and the edge room, for Texas, these are good problems to have, especially when you're going to the SEC and you're taking a jump in competition and when you're competing, which is what the program standard should be now going forward and legitimately can be going forward, competing for a national championship. So an abundance of riches at those positions, especially on the defensive side of the ball in a physical conference like the SEC, is going to be very important and it's very valuable for the Longhorns going forward. And speaking of that, that goal to be in the national championship, I think I was browsing the Horns 24/7 board last night during the championship game and saw a good question from Porky on the board. Does Texas improve or take a step back next year with an SEC schedule and a plethora of new players? So I think it's a bit too early to make a full breakdown on how Texas's 2024 season will go. There's still a lot of questions left to be answered with staying and going. I think the biggest of which being whether or not Quinn Ewers returns. Seems likely that he will, but there's no official word on that just yet. So we'll probably do a full video on that when the time is right to make our full season predictions and a full outlook on how Texas will match up against the SEC in their first year. But I will give you my quote-unquote way too early thoughts on it. So with a massive jump in competition and losing some really, really valuable pieces like Xavier Worthy, Adonai Mitchell, T'Vondre Sweat, Jalen Ford, I wouldn't say that Texas regresses, but I think there might be some growing pains with so much young talent being inserted into the mix and the addition into the SEC. Both of those things mixed together, I think might cause some growing pains for Texas in year one. The talent, no doubt about it, is there, but is the experience there? Can that experience be built up quickly enough to hang with some of the best teams in the SEC and some of the best teams in the nation? Texas has Michigan week 2, the reigning national champions. They'll have Georgia at home a few weeks later. They've got Oklahoma in the Red River shootout again. And then they've got 2 rivals coming onto the schedule in Arkansas and Texas A&M. No matter where those teams are at, roster-wise, that's going to be a harsh environment. And rivalry games are always so much tougher to win, especially considering they're both on the road. So, I also think about the close wins that Texas had this season, the nail-biter wins against Houston and Kansas State. Those opponents now turn into the Floridas, the Arkansas, completely different teams that if Texas doesn't bring their best and they get the A game from the opponent, it might be very difficult to win. And maybe some of those games go the other team's way and Texas drops 1 or 2 more games. So I'm by no means saying that Texas is going to be bad next year. I don't think the Longhorns are going to be a bottom half SEC team. I think honestly they'll be in the top half and potentially competing for an SEC championship. That is a completely valid take, and I think a completely valid goal for the Longhorns going into their first season. But I'm with our guy Jeff Howe in saying that 9+ wins in the regular season for Texas would be a absolutely monstrally successful year and start for Texas in the SEC. That's going to wrap things up for us here on the Longhorn Mailbag. Thanks again so much for joining us here on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. The season might be over, but our content is not. So make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications so you're the first to know when new stuff is headed your way. For the rest of the crew, I'm Tommy Yarrish. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.